In 2012, Lakestone, a small town in western Colorado, lived a measured and quiet life. People moved here to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, large office buildings, and traffic jams. Lakestone's residents cherished its calm and predictability: clean streets, houses with well-kept lawns, the sound of church bells on Sundays, and quiet evenings filled with the scent of freshly cut grass or coffee from local diners. At the center of town was the old Starlight Cinema, a popular spot for romantic dates and relaxation. This theater had witnessed the days of film reels and couples holding hands while watching the flickering screen. Yet, behind its cozy facade lurked the shadow of a story that had yet to end. Jake Wilson was part of this town. He had moved here 6 years ago after transferring from Washington, where his FBI career had begun. In Lakestone, he found what he had been searching for over the years: a home, peace, and a woman he loved. His wife Kelly was born and raised in Lakestone. She always valued coziness and simplicity, dreaming of spending evenings with her husband over cups of cocoa and long conversations about life. At first, their life truly resembled a fairy tale: fresh air, evening walks, and cozy winters by the fireplace. But after a few years, everything changed. Jake was dedicated to his work. Despite Lakestone's unhurried rhythm, his job required constant vigilance. He often stayed late at the office, working on reports, analyzing evidence, and conducting investigations to uphold the department's reputation. But every return home became a test for him. Kelly worked as a waitress at the local restaurant Blue Star. This restaurant was known throughout the county for its pies and vintage atmosphere. To the customers, Kelly was always friendly, smiling and joking, though inside she was burned out with exhaustion. Her shifts lasted 10 hours, and by the end of them, she returned home utterly drained. The home that had once been her fortress had turned into a place filled with silent emptiness. Every morning, Jake woke up at 6:30 a.m. His day always started the same: a warm shower, quickly made coffee, and a dry toast. He ate alone at the kitchen table, scrolling through the news on his smartphone. In the early years of their marriage, Kelly used to get up with him, make breakfast, and see him off at the door with a kiss. Now, her place at the table remained empty. She continued to sleep while Jake left the house in silence. On his way to work, he drove down streets he knew by heart. His thoughts often drifted as he pondered when exactly their relationship began to crack. Was this slow collapse inevitable, or had he simply failed to stop the process in time? Kelly usually woke up an hour after he left. She would slowly walk downstairs as if every movement required effort, pour herself a cup of coffee, and stare out the window into the yard. In those moments, her gaze was empty. She would watch the neighbor walking his dog, the school bus stopping at the corner, and catch herself thinking that none of it mattered to her. Every day felt the same as the last. Work consumed all her time and energy, and free time had become something distant and forgotten. When Jake came home in the evenings, he would open the door and hold his breath for a moment, as if hoping to hear something: greetings, the sounds of dinner cooking, or his wife's laughter. But instead, he was met with silence. He would toss his jacket over the back of a chair, heat up some food or order delivery, sit at the table alone, and eat while staring at his phone. Sometimes Kelly was home, but instead of talking, she would only nod or give one-word answers. Every dinner became a silent ritual. Jake tried to regain their closeness. He brought home flowers, roses or daisies, which used to be her favorites. Sometimes he suggested weekend getaways, trips out of town, or dinner at a restaurant, but each time Kelly would respond the same way: "I need to rest, maybe later." Over time, Jake stopped bringing flowers and making suggestions. He realized that all his efforts only echoed back in emptiness. A few times, he tried to have an honest conversation with her, but each time he felt a wall between them. Kelly had become a different person, but so had he. His workdays drained his energy and time, and at home he was lost in the cold emptiness. Sometimes he sat in his car for long periods before going inside without turning off the engine. He would stare at the lights in the windows, which seemed unfamiliar to him. It felt as though it wasn't him and his wife living there, but two entirely different people. On that winter evening, as the cold wind swept through the town streets, Jake felt especially alone. He didn't want to go home. He knew that if he walked inside and was once again met with that overwhelming silence, he would break down. He pulled up the collar of his coat and walked down the street toward the Starlight Cinema. This place had been part of his life since his first days in Lakestone. He often came here to take his mind off work and immerse himself in another world. The theater was nearly empty. In the evening twilight, its neon sign glowed warmly, creating a sense of something familiar and comforting. Inside, the air smelled of popcorn and old carpeting that creaked slightly underfoot. Jake bought a ticket for the next screening and sat in the theater, relishing the chance to forget about home, work, and thoughts of where everything had gone wrong for at least a couple of hours. He had no idea that this spontaneous trip to the movies would mark the beginning of events that would change his life forever. Inside, the Starlight Cinema looked exactly as Jake remembered it from his first visit. Red velvet seats, slightly worn from time, soft, dim lights lining the walls, and the familiar scent of popcorn that had seeped into the carpets. It felt as though time had stopped here. The place evoked a pleasant sense of nostalgia, as if the past had come alive again. Jake bought a large box of popcorn and a bottle of soda, then made his way to his seat in the middle of the hall. The evening show wasn't very popular. A few people had taken seats in the front rows, an elderly couple settled in the back, and the space was filled with a soft hum of occasional conversations and the rustling of snack wrappers. Jake sat down, made himself comfortable, and exhaled, feeling the tension finally begin to fade. At that moment, his eyes accidentally fell on a young woman sitting 2 rows ahead of him. She was alone, tall, slender, with long blonde hair cascading over her shoulders. She leaned slightly forward, searching for something in her bag, unaware of the glances around her. Jake noticed her delicate facial features, a sharp chin, a high forehead, and prominent cheekbones. There was something captivating, almost magnetic, about her appearance. For a second, Jake looked away, feeling embarrassed, but something inside him held him back. He stole another glance in her direction. She looked to be about 10 years younger than him, no older than 22. He wondered why she had come alone, but quickly chastised himself for the thought. He had come here to take his mind off things, not to notice someone else. The movie started. The screen lit up with bright colors, and the first scenes captured the audience's attention. However, Jake kept catching himself glancing at the girl. She sat still, watching the screen intently, but there was a sense of ease in her posture, as if she was unwinding after a long day. Half an hour into the film, the girl turned her head and locked eyes with Jake. It was so unexpected and direct that Jake felt caught red-handed. But instead of looking away or frowning, she smiled. A brief, friendly smile. Jake awkwardly nodded in response, feeling his heartbeat quicken. He knew he was acting like a teenager, but he couldn't help himself. When the film ended and the credits rolled across the screen, the hall began to empty. One by one, the audience members left without lingering. Jake stayed in his seat, as if waiting for something. The girl stood up, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked slowly toward the exit. Before stepping out, she paused by the door, glanced back, and met his gaze again. It was clear. This wasn't a coincidence. Jake felt this was his chance. He couldn't explain why, but something inside urged him to act. He jumped up from his seat, tossed the empty popcorn box aside, and headed toward the exit. The girl stood by the display of movie posters, studying the schedule of upcoming films. He stepped closer and stopped a step away from her. Nothing about this moment was premeditated. Everything was happening naturally. The lights of the evening city flickered outside the window. It was already dark, and Lakestone's narrow streets were bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and neon signs. The girl looked even more beautiful in the bright light. She wore a dark coat and heeled boots. Jake noticed her minimal makeup, almost imperceptible, which gave her a natural beauty. After a brief pause, Jake learned her name, Lily Brooks. She told him she had recently returned to her hometown of Lakestone after spending several months working in New York, where she had modeled for magazine covers and advertising campaigns. Lily was a model, and her career was on the rise. Jake, surprised, realized that her face did seem familiar. He had probably seen her photos on billboards and in magazines. Their conversation began with the film, but gradually shifted to personal topics. Lily shared that after a busy work life, she longed for a simpler life, peace, walks through familiar streets, and unhurried evenings. Jake listened to her voice, and with every word, he felt the tension and pain of the past months dissolve. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so at ease. They strolled down the main street of town, illuminated by the lights of store windows. The air was cold and fresh, but neither of them wanted to part. Lily seemed like someone from another world, a world where ease and joy still existed. In that moment, Jake realized that something in his life had changed. He didn't even try to fight the feeling. When they reached the intersection, Lily stopped and said it was time for her to head home. Before saying goodbye, she handed him her phone and suggested they exchange numbers. Jake entered his contact info, and she smiled, as if she knew their meeting was no accident. Night had fallen over Lakestone. Jake stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching Lily disappear around the corner. He felt a strange mix of emotions, a rush of energy, and a faint sense of unease. He knew that when he returned home, he would be a different person. After that meeting, something inside Jake changed. His life, which had recently been full of emptiness and monotony, suddenly took on new colors. The cold morning coffee in the kitchen no longer seemed so tasteless. Days that used to drag on endlessly now passed quickly. Every minute spent waiting for a new message from Lily made his heart beat a little faster. Their correspondence began with simple phrases about the movie they had watched. But soon, the messages became longer, deeper, and more personal. Lily shared stories about her life in New York, the glitz and noise of photo shoots, and the loneliness of living in a huge city. Jake, in turn, opened up about his childhood memories of summers at the lake, his dream of working for the FBI, and his routine days filled with reports and investigations. A few days after they met, Lily suggested meeting again. Jake didn't hesitate. He felt that this meeting was inevitable. After work that evening, he drove to the lakeside, where they had agreed to meet. Lily was waiting for him on a bench near the water, wrapped in a warm scarf. She held a cup of hot cocoa in her hands, and her eyes glowed with a soft, warm light. They walked along the water, listening to the cold wind ripple across the lake's surface. Lily spoke about her dream, to return to Lakestone and open a small art cafe. Her voice was so lively and calm that to Jake, it felt like music. He couldn't take his eyes off her. After just a few meetings, Jake couldn't imagine his day without her. Their encounters became more frequent and lasted longer. They went to the cinema where it all began, ate pancakes at a 24-hour diner, and even spent an evening on the rooftop of one of the old buildings, drinking hot coffee and watching the stars. To Jake, it felt like an escape from his own life. He began lying to Kelly more and more often. At first, they were small excuses. "We have an emergency meeting," or "I need to stay late with my colleagues." But soon, the lies became more elaborate and thought out. He felt guilty, but memories of the empty evenings at home quickly silenced that feeling. Jake convinced himself that he deserved a little happiness and that he wasn't doing anything truly wrong. Kelly, however, started noticing the changes. She was too tired to understand immediately what was happening, but even her dulled emotions picked up on Jake's coldness and detachment. Jake began coming home later, and his responses grew short and indifferent. She no longer heard words of support from him or any desire to spend time together. And although their relationship had long since grown cold, this new behavior felt like something else, something impossible to ignore. One evening, when Jake stayed late at work again, Kelly sat on the couch with a cup of tea, staring at the blank TV screen. She remembered how they used to watch movies together, sitting under the same blanket. Those memories felt like ghosts from a past life. Finally, she decided she couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. The next day, Kelly left her shift early and returned home to prepare herself. She put on a warm coat and drove to the FBI office, knowing that Jake was due to finish his shift in a few minutes. She parked across the street and waited, watching the door. A few minutes later, Jake stepped out of the office. He looked around but didn't notice Kelly's car. She held her breath, feeling her heart pounding. At that moment, he got into a taxi and headed down the street. Kelly started the engine and began following him at a safe distance. Her breathing became shallow and uneven. She understood she was doing something she never thought she would, but her desire to know the truth was stronger. 20 minutes later, the taxi stopped near a park. At that exact moment, Lily appeared from the path. Lily, the girl Kelly didn't know but instinctively distrusted. Jake opened the taxi door and invited Lily inside. They laughed about something and the car pulled away. What Kelly saw made everything inside her tighten. She couldn't believe her eyes. Her husband, the man she trusted despite their distance, was with another woman. Kelly followed them until they reached an apartment complex. Jake and Lily got out of the car and headed toward her apartment, as though they had forgotten about the rest of the world. They didn't even glance back. Kelly remained in her car, sitting motionless, until the light in Lily's window went out. When she returned home, everything around her felt unreal. The silence in the house, which she had once hated, now seemed deafening. She slowly walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Her thoughts were chaotic and fragmented. She struggled to understand what she would do next. Kelly sat in the kitchen, in complete silence. The stove light slowly dimmed. The kettle had cooled and no longer boiled. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but each tick felt like a hammer blow to her mind. The only image in her head was of Jake with that girl. Their laughter, their carefree ease, as if they were the protagonists of a romantic movie and not characters from her own life. Kelly's heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. She felt her world collapsing into ruins, leaving no room for hope. She moved through that day in a fog. The next morning, Kelly woke up earlier than usual. At first, her thoughts were jumbled and chaotic, but then they took on a sharp clarity. Instead of tears or fear, a growing sense of rage and resentment filled her. She recalled how many years she had given to their relationship, how she had supported Jake even when he forgot she existed, and now he had so easily thrown their life away, like an old, useless thing. That evening, she made a decision. It was reckless and dangerous, but it seemed like the only possible way out. On the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, behind jars of grains, stood a small glass bottle filled with a clear liquid. A few years ago, a colleague of Kelly's, known for her dark humor, had given her the bottle as a joke, saying, "If your husband ever cheats, you'll know what to do." In reality, it was poison commonly used for killing rats. Kelly had laughed it off at the time and tucked the bottle away, never imagining she would ever hold it in her hands again. Now the bottle became a symbol of justice for her. She held it in her hand, staring at the clear liquid, and felt the fury and pain burn away the last traces of doubt. The next day, Jake returned home late. His face showed calm and exhaustion. He took off his coat, hung it on the rack, and walked into the kitchen where Kelly was casually setting the table for dinner. She placed his favorite dish, meat casserole with potatoes and cheese, on the table. The rich, comforting aroma filled the air, momentarily making Jake feel the warmth of home again. "You made dinner?" he asked, surprised. Kelly said nothing, only gestured toward the chair as if everything was normal. Jake sat down and began to eat. A sense of peace spread through him. Perhaps there was still a chance to return to their old life. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. But Kelly didn't look at him. She stood at the sink, silently washing the dishes as he finished his last bite. After dinner, Jake thanked her and said he felt tired. He went upstairs and lay down in bed, unaware that in just an hour, his body would begin to fail him. At first, Jake felt a slight weakness, then came a wave of nausea that quickly intensified. His forehead was drenched in sweat, his head spun, and his heart pounded as if trying to break free from his chest. He slid off the bed trying to stand, but his body refused to obey. Jake realized something serious was happening. Kelly sat in the kitchen and heard the muffled sounds of footsteps above her, but didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the empty space in front of her, her fingers trembling against the table. A few minutes passed, then silence. Later that night, when the house was shrouded in darkness, Jake passed away. His body lay motionless on the bedroom floor, his face frozen in a grimace of pain. Kelly didn't go upstairs until dawn. She stood over him, staring at his pale face, feeling nothing but a strange emptiness. Now she faced another problem. What to do next? The thought that she could be caught had seemed distant and unreal at first, but now fear began to creep in. She knew that if she didn't act, her life would be over. But the fear didn't paralyze her. It only made her act coldly and methodically. Kelly wrapped Jake's body in an old sheet and dragged him downstairs to the basement. The basement of their house was dim, with a concrete floor and wooden shelves stocked with winter preserves and tools. In the far corner was a large canvas sack that had once been used to store old sports equipment. Kelly carefully placed the body inside the sack, tied it shut, and placed it behind the shelving where it wouldn't be seen. She went back upstairs and opened the windows to air out the rooms and get rid of any suspicious odors. Then she changed the bed linens and scrubbed the floors, meticulously cleaning every detail. When the house once again looked clean and orderly, Kelly felt an almost eerie calm. But that calm was deceptive. Inside her, panic lay in wait, ready to burst out at any moment. In the following days, Kelly tried to behave as usual. She went to work, smiled at customers, and completed her daily tasks, though her smile concealed intense tension, and she couldn't sleep at night. Jake's colleagues noticed his absence after just a couple of days and began calling his phone. He didn't answer. With each unanswered call, the ringing in Kelly's home grew louder and louder, as if demanding an explanation. She knew she couldn't hide forever, yet deep down, a small part of her still hoped that somehow this would all pass her by. When the knock at the door came, Kelly froze. Standing on the doorstep were Jake's colleagues and the police. They held a search warrant. From the moment the agents stepped into her home, Kelly already knew. Her lies, her attempt to cover her tracks, it had all been in vain. What had started as feelings of betrayal and pain had turned into a chain of irreversible events that now led her, unrelentingly, to the truth and the consequences. When the knock came at the door, Kelly was standing in the kitchen, staring at the empty glass left from breakfast. The sound was loud and insistent, as if it were a reminder of the inevitable. Her heart sank, and her hands began to tremble. She had known this day would come, but she didn't expect it to be so soon. She wiped her hands on a towel, trying to collect her thoughts, and walked toward the door. On the doorstep stood FBI agents and police officers. One of them held a search warrant. They were Jake's colleagues, people he knew and trusted. Now they were looking at her with cold, focused expressions. All traces of friendliness were gone. Only professionals remained, doing their job. Kelly stepped aside to let them in, giving a barely noticeable nod. Resistance was pointless. She understood that any attempt to delay the inevitable would only worsen her situation. The agents began methodically searching the house, moving from room to room, checking every cabinet, every shelf, and the papers on Jake's desk. They moved calmly and precisely, like parts of a well-oiled machine. The house was impeccably clean, almost too clean. Freshly scrubbed tiles, a neatly made bed with perfectly smoothed blankets. None of it escaped their notice. One of the agents paused briefly, observing the unnaturally pristine state of the house. Kelly noticed his glance and realized that this tidiness had become a red flag for them. Something about it felt wrong. In the kitchen, they found Jake's untouched coffee cup. He always used that same cup in the mornings. For Jake's colleagues, who knew his habits, it was another troubling sign. The cup looked as though it hadn't been used in days. Once the first floor was searched, the agents moved down to the basement. Kelly stayed at the top of the stairs, watching as they descended. She froze in place, afraid to even breathe. The basement was dark and cold. The beams of their flashlights illuminated the concrete floor, the shelves lined with boxes, jars of preserves, and a toolbox. At first, everything appeared ordinary, but in the far corner of the basement lay a thick canvas sack, carelessly placed near the wall. One of the flashlights stopped on the sack. The fabric was rough, with visible signs of dust and wear, but the shape and position hinted that something large was inside. An agent stepped closer and lifted the top edge of the sack. A second later, a sharp, unmistakable smell filled the air. A sinister silence fell over the basement, as if time had stopped. When the sack was fully opened, all doubts vanished. Jake's body lay motionless inside, his limbs awkwardly bent and his face frozen in a grimace of pain. His pale skin, with a bluish hue, and his lifeless gaze revealed the horror of his final moments. The discovery was too damning to hide. One of the agents ascended the stairs with a stony expression. In that moment, Kelly understood that her world had completely collapsed. Her heart felt as if it had stopped beating, her head spun, and her legs weakened. She knew it was over. The cold metallic sound of handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The officers led her outside, where the flashing lights of the patrol cars illuminated the facades of the neighboring houses. A few people stood on their porches, watching as Jake Wilson's wife, the once kind and quiet woman, was placed in a car and driven away. Rumors spread through the town in an instant. At the station, the standard procedures began: fingerprinting, photographs, and paperwork. Kelly sat in the interrogation room with a vacant expression and an empty soul. She knew that her life hadn't just changed, it was over. The next morning, news of the FBI agent's murder and his wife's arrest spread across Lakestone. Newspapers and local TV stations competed to report the details. The body was found in the basement, death was caused by a powerful poison, and the autopsy confirmed that it had been a painful death. The revelations sparked waves of discussion among the townspeople. People who knew Kelly personally tried to recall anything that might explain her actions. Jake's colleagues recalled their restrained marriage, polite but distant glances at one another, and their rare appearances at social events. But no one could have imagined that such a chasm of despair lay beneath their silence. Investigators delved into phone records, messages, and financial reports. In the process, they uncovered signs of Jake's double life, hidden trips and frequent messages to the same woman. Yet these facts did not absolve Kelly in the eyes of the law. The investigation's sole focus was whether her act of vengeance had been premeditated or spontaneous. While the entire town speculated and whispered about Kelly's motives, she sat alone, surrounded by 4 concrete walls. She no longer tried to explain herself or make excuses. She knew that her choice had become inevitable the moment she saw her husband with someone else. Now, all she could do was wait for the verdict. The trial of Kelly Wilson began 2 months after her arrest. The town of Lakestone held its breath in tense anticipation. This was the first high-profile case of its kind in their quiet, orderly town. Hundreds of residents followed the news daily and discussed every new fact. The courthouse, once almost empty, had become the center of attention, surrounded by journalists with cameras and notepads. Local newspaper headlines screamed phrases like "FBI agent's wife, murderer, or victim," and "What was hidden behind the facade of a happy marriage?" The courtroom was packed. In the front rows sat Jake's former colleagues, serious, focused men and women who couldn't believe that someone from their circle could be murdered so cold-bloodedly. On the defendant's bench, Kelly sat with her hands clasped and her eyes vacant. Her face was pale and exhausted, yet she maintained an outward calm that the prosecution interpreted as cold indifference. Her attorney, a young but ambitious defender, tried to keep a professional demeanor, though he knew the case appeared hopeless. The prosecution presented compelling evidence. The murder weapon, a bottle of poison, was found in the trash can near their home. Kelly's fingerprints were found on the bottle. Experts confirmed that Jake's death had resulted from ingesting a powerful substance that caused respiratory failure and organ damage. The autopsy revealed that Jake had died slowly, making the story all the more horrifying. But the most devastating blow to the court came from the recordings of Jake's calls and text messages with Lily Brooks. Excerpts of their conversations were read aloud, where Jake spoke to Lily about his dreams of a new life and mentioned the problems in his marriage. Lily's testimony confirmed their relationship, though she emphasized that she never suspected their affair would lead to tragedy. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but Kelly barely listened. She sat motionless, staring straight ahead, as if disconnected from the world around her. Kelly's attorney tried to build a defense based on her mental state. He spoke about the years of emotional neglect, her loneliness, and the sense of betrayal that had become the final straw. He described her actions as a momentary outburst, an attempt to regain control of her life, which she had lost because of her husband's betrayal. But despite these arguments, the judge and jury were more concerned with the methodical planning and secrecy of the crime. Everything pointed to premeditation. The jury deliberated for several hours, though for Kelly, it felt like an eternity. She sat alone, surrounded by whispers and stares, as if standing at the edge between life and complete ruin. When the jury returned to the courtroom, their expressions were unreadable. The foreman stood and read the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The judge announced the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A dead silence fell over the room, followed by a faint murmur. Someone whispered. Someone sobbed. Lily Brooks covered her face with her hands, while Jake's colleagues stared at Kelly, not with hatred, but with cold condemnation. At the guard's request, Kelly rose from the defendant's bench. Her hands were once again cuffed. She took several steps toward the exit, never looking back. She knew there was no point in seeking a familiar face. No one would offer her a hand of support. Later, she was transferred to a maximum security prison out of state. A cell with concrete walls and a narrow window became her new home. In the beginning, she spoke very little and spent hours sitting on her cot, staring at the small beam of light filtering through the barred window. Her thoughts drifted far from this gray world. They returned to the moment when she stood in the park and saw Jake for the first time, smiling at her with a coffee in his hands. Her name became known throughout Lakestone, but soon the memory of her turned into another crime story, discussed only to be forgotten. Lily Brooks left town a month after the trial, unable to endure the public scrutiny. Jake's colleagues remained silent for a long time, remembering him as a dedicated agent and a good man, whose actions outside of work they preferred not to discuss. Meanwhile, Kelly remained in her cell, alone, surrounded by the sound of guards' footsteps and the echoes of distant voices. Her life had become a monotonous string of endless days. Every sound outside her cell was a reminder of the life she had lost. Her punishment wasn't only the life sentence, it was the knowledge that, despite the pain and betrayal, she would forever be the woman who crossed a line from which there was no return. After the verdict was announced, life in Lakestone gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but the shadow of the tragedy lingered in the town's collective memory. The Wilsons' house became a grim reminder of how quickly an ideal life could collapse. The faded curtains in the windows, peeling paint on the porch, and an empty yard gave the impression that even the building itself felt the weight of what had happened. For months, the house stood vacant before being put up for sale. However, prospective buyers avoided it. The whispers about the horror it had witnessed were too strong. Reports about Kelly's trial and sentencing gradually disappeared from the newspapers. New events and incidents took the place of old news. The story that had shaken the town slowly but surely faded into the background. Yet, for a few people, it remained an unhealed wound. Lily Brooks left Lakestone a month after the trial ended. She left behind her modeling career and public life, hoping to start fresh. To everyone, she was just the woman who ruined a family, even though she had committed no crime. Yet that shadow followed her wherever she went. She vanished from magazine covers and advertising campaigns, and her traces in the fashion industry disappeared. No one knew where she eventually settled or how her life turned out. Jake's FBI colleagues remained silent for a long time. Tension filled the office corridors whenever his name was mentioned. Some defended his reputation, saying that personal mistakes shouldn't overshadow his professional achievements. Others quietly condemned him for the double life that had ultimately led to tragedy. Over time, his desk was cleared, his case files reassigned, and only a photograph on the memorial wall remained, a reminder that even the best could fall. Kelly Wilson became inmate number 457-21 at a maximum security women's prison outside the state of Colorado. Her cell was small, concrete walls, a metal bed, a bolted-down table, and a tiny window with bars through which barely any light passed. Her daily routine was always the same: wake up, breakfast, several hours of work, and endless stretches of silence that seemed to last forever. At first, the guards and other inmates watched her closely, a quiet woman with an empty stare who didn't try to please anyone or draw attention to herself. She was like a shadow among the other prisoners. But as the years passed, people grew used to her presence, and she became just another fixture in the prison world. No one asked who she used to be or what had brought her there. Everyone knew her story and saw no need to retell it. The only reminders of her past were the rare letters from old acquaintances, which came less and less frequently as the years went by. The photos and postcards showed scenes of Lakestone, familiar streets, the lake, the Blue Star restaurant. But Kelly never opened the envelopes. She was afraid the memories would overwhelm her too suddenly. Instead, she stared at the rays of light that filtered through the bars and counted them, as though they marked the passage of time that slipped by unnoticed and irretrievably. Her punishment wasn't just life imprisonment. The true punishment was waking up every day and reliving it all over again. That evening, the smell of casserole in the kitchen, the tremor in her hands, the sound of Jake's footsteps upstairs, and the emptiness that enveloped her once everything was over. In her mind, it became an endless loop, playing over and over again. Years passed, and Kelly stopped keeping track of time. The seasons changed. Winter turned to spring. But these changes meant nothing to her. At some point, even her name began to be forgotten. People no longer spoke the name Kelly Wilson with judgment or pity. They simply stopped mentioning it. The story of the FBI agent's wife who murdered her husband became a rumor, retold with different words, until it turned into just another urban legend. But Kelly no longer cared. Her life had ended the day she saw her husband with another woman. Everything that came after, the trial, the prison, the long hours of solitude, was merely the price she paid for the mistake that pain had driven her to make. Eventually, the silence of her cell became familiar and almost comforting. She no longer waited for freedom or forgiveness. For her, there was no past and no future. Only emptiness. She simply existed in that gray world, where nothing changed and nothing could bring back the life she had lost on that fateful evening. Years in prison became a blur of identical days that seemed to erase Kelly's sense of self. Yet there were moments when she still felt the passage of time. Jake's birthdays, their wedding anniversary, and that fateful day when her life turned into a nightmare. These dates pierced her memory, causing old wounds to bleed anew. She still remembered his face, the way it looked during the final moments of their calm existence. His betrayal had cut her deeply, but the memory of the love they once shared remained indelible. However, one day something changed. One morning, a prison warden entered her cell holding an envelope with a red seal. It was an official document. Kelly had grown used to the monotony of her life, where nothing new or unexpected ever happened. She slowly took the letter, not even trying to guess what it might be. It turned out to be a notice for a retrial. A new lawyer, who specialized in complex cases, had filed an appeal for her sentence to be reviewed. His argument was that the original trial had overlooked Kelly's emotional state and the immense pressure she was under. Over the years, public opinion had begun to shift. People now saw her not only as a criminal, but also as a victim. Questions resurfaced about Jake's double life, their broken relationship, and what had driven Kelly to her fatal decision. A few weeks later, Kelly was taken to a new court hearing. She sat in the courtroom, surrounded by jurors, the judge, and the hum of journalists' cameras. But this time, she felt no fear. She had already lost everything she could, and now she teetered on the edge of complete apathy. Psychologists and family conflict experts testified during the trial. One expert, speaking with clinical detachment, explained how victim syndrome could have pushed her into a state of emotional shock, a state where a person acts impulsively, unaware of their actions. His words stirred the courtroom. Even the initially unmoved jurors began whispering among themselves. This time, the narrative shifted. Kelly no longer seemed like the monster she had been painted as during the first trial. After weeks of hearings, the court issued a new verdict. She was still found guilty, but her sentence was reduced to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole. It wasn't full exoneration, but it was a chance she never expected, a chance far greater than she had dared to hope for. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, reporters waited outside once again, but their gazes were less accusatory. Lake Stone was a town that always sought someone to blame, but it was also capable of forgiveness. Kelly's story had become a tragedy filled with shades of gray. There were no heroes or villains, only mistakes born from a broken marriage and human weakness. In prison, time began to flow differently for her again. She started reading books, writing journals, and even helping other inmates by sharing her story. She was no longer the shattered woman who had entered the prison years ago. She now understood that her life didn't end within those 4 concrete walls. 15 years later, Kelly was granted early release for good behavior. It happened early in the morning, when the ground was still wrapped in mist. No one was waiting for her at the gates, no friends, no family, just a gentle breeze that reminded her of morning walks by the Lake Stone Lake. She stepped outside, holding a small paper bag containing her few personal belongings. Her steps were cautious, but steady. She didn't know where to go, or what to do next. The world she had left behind 15 years ago was now a different place. People lived differently, technology had advanced, and the faces she once knew had disappeared. But along with that came something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of freedom. A few weeks later, Kelly returned to Lake Stone. The streets were almost the same as she remembered. The Starlight Cinema still stood, though its sign was new, and a modern cafe had been built next door. She walked past the Blue Star restaurant where she had once worked and stopped by the lake where she used to stroll with Jake. A light breeze rippled the water, and the sky was clear and calm. Kelly sat on a bench and closed her eyes. Memories of the past flickered in her mind, their first dates, cozy evenings, conversations about the future, and then everything that had shattered their life. But now she saw it differently. She no longer felt rage or pain, only regret and quiet sorrow. In that moment she realized that her release wasn't just a release from prison, it was a release from her past. The life she had lost would never return, but ahead lay a new path. It might not be a happy one, but it was hers. Kelly rose from the bench and began walking slowly along the shoreline. Each step was light and assured, as if she were learning to walk on this earth again. Ahead stretched a new day, simple and ordinary, but finally her own.